Welcome back to another Terranscapes video. I want to welcome all the new viewers and subscribers. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. Hope you find something here that's interesting or entertaining. This video was supposed to be on the Charabanc and its engine. I've been doing a lot of design work. I've started construction. And when I started moving files, I realized I ran out of space on my 2 SSD hard drives that are dedicated to video editing. So I needed to edit these videos so I can get them uploaded, and then have space to do the Charabanc video. So this is going to be part 1 of a three-parter on applying the bark to the tree that I've been working on. And a couple quick notes about it before we begin. One is that this is a learning tree for me. Hopefully it's a learning tree for you as well. So I'm not showing you best practices, but along the way, I have a lot of reflection on it and indicate what I think would be best practices or better practices. So it's sort of a little bit of what I learned and how I would fix it going forward. And this technique is based on Modeling Trees Part 1 Broadleaves by Gordon Gravitt. And he has a recipe I'm going to put that in air quotes, on how to mix up materials to apply to create a bark texture on a wire armature tree. And it is lacking in a lot of details. So what you're going to see is some trial and error on my part. And that is why I wanted to try to model his technique. And there was definitely a learning curve involved with that. Also, this is the biggest tree that I've tried to construct wire armature wise. And that has added some of the learning to it, as some things are being revealed to me that wouldn't necessarily have shown up as much on a much smaller tree. And because some people are probably going to mention it, and it was mentioned to me already, that I could instead use an epoxy putty like Green Stuff or Milliput or even Super Sculpey or something like that to create the bark texture. And I'm going to talk more about that at the end of the series, but I do mention it along the way about where I think it would have made a help or better situation for me when I was doing certain aspects of the construction. So you will see me comment on that, and I will talk about it more at the end of the whole series. And many people, I think, don't watch all 3 parts. I get it. But I just want to mention that, there are reflections that I have as the process goes along that is sort of a hindsight and kind of references things that happened earlier in the series. So that's just something to keep in mind if you're wondering whether you want to follow the series all the way through. Know that there are some things at the end that I'm like, oh, if only I had done this back then, this would have made this better, kind of an idea. So with all of that said, let us go and take a look at how I worked on the bark for the tree and see what things I discovered along the way. Just to explain the base here, block of wood, hole drilled in the bottom of it, but also a piece of packing tape on the top so that when we apply materials to the roots, it won't stick to the wooden block. And what I've done also to secure the tree to the base is I have added a blob of hot glue to the stem that sticks into the hole, and not a ton, just enough on one side to lock it in place. And that's relatively easy to break it off at the end when we're done and we're ready to remove it. So the next step we're going to do is to paint it with white glue. And in the effort of full disclosure, this is a step I actually have not done in the past. And skimming through Gordon's book today, Mr. Gravitt, I don't know him well enough to call him Gordon. He uses this step to give a little bit more of a bite when we apply the bark. And I have found that getting the bark to the final, very fine tips of the wires and having it stick there is actually not easy, because it's very slick and it's hard to get a thin coating on it. So I can't see anything wrong with adding a layer of PVA glue to the armature, and I think it's going to help speed up the addition of the bark. And we'll both check out how it helps with the fine tips of the branches, but I suspect it's going to improve it. And while I start this, I should say that the PVA glue is undiluted, so this is straight out of the bottle. The main thing you're going to want to avoid is drips or sags, as those will definitely show when it is dry, and it'd be something, again, that you're going to have to try to fix after the fact. You'll notice that I'm working my way down from the top of the tree. I find that that's just an organized process to go with, and also that if there are sags or drips, they are occurring at the sort of working edge of the glue. So that gives me an ability to catch them, so to speak, a little bit more easily. The brush I'm using is not a bad brush. I think oftentimes modelers feel like they want to use trashy brushes for processes like this, dry brushing, spreading glues, things like that. And I strongly discourage that. This is not a good brush. This is not something I will do fine painting work with, for instance. I do have a sort of retirement system where brushes do move down the line, but I don't ever want to work with a brush that is in very, very bad shape, because you can't control, and while this is sort of a gross material application, not disgusting gross, but sort of large body material, where you might not think you need fine control, a decent brush is going to provide you with a better material holding ability. The bristles are going to be in better shape, and so they're going to retain more material. And without them splaying everywhere, you have more control about where you're going to put your material as well. So I definitely always discourage using a totally mashed bristle, crazy splayed, frayed tip brush for really anything, particularly dry brushing, which is what a lot of people will relegate their really bad brushes to. And I disagree with that use there as well. So you might be tempted to just add a really large blob to an area like this where there's a deep recess in here. And I would discourage that, meaning that when you apply something, let's get a little more on that brush. When you apply any kind of material like this that has to dry, it's an evaporative process. And what happens is that you will end up with the glue skinning over. And when it skins over, it makes the material underneath it much slower to dry, because now it has a barrier to letting that solvent, whatever the solvent is, evaporate. So you'd be much better served applying a couple of layers of very thin glue, which is going to dry very, very quickly. And in fact, on something like this, I'm expecting, depending on your temperature and humidity, I'm expecting the top of the tree to be pretty much dry by the time I get to the bottom of the tree. At this point, I finished the coat. So this gives you a look at what that texture looks like at this point. And if you notice right here, the glue has made a little bridge at this joint. It's a little thick right there. And I don't really want that thick. Now, if you know anything about me, you know that I get a little picky about things. But this should be a fairly sharp joint. And so having a little blob there will kind of break up that illusion. This is a little bit interior from the outside of the tree, and of course with the foliage, that probably isn't going to show. but it is something that I just kind of keep an eye on. So we're going to do the bark now, and this recipe is not a firm recipe from the Gravett book, Mr. Gravett, because he actually doesn't give proportions. But we're going to be using plaster, and you could use other kinds of plaster like the super strength plaster from Woodland Scenic or their Hydrocal or plaster of Paris or any those kinds of plasters. We're going to use white glue, and we're going to use black tempera paint. And just before we start mixing, just a quick tip, cut a popsicle stick flat and it will scrape the bottom more evenly so you can get that mixing done a little bit more uniform, a little bit more quickly. So I eyeball it, and his instructions don't give a recipe, so perhaps he eyeballs it as well. I do say 2 or 3 tablespoons, and my glue is a little bit, it's been sitting on the shelf for a while, so it had a little separation there, but nothing a little quick mix can't fix. So then I start with a little bit of plaster. And it's a scoop. That's an amount that makes sense. And I do the same with the tempera paint. Now you might think because the glue is water-based that the plaster and the tempera might set up, and this might become this might cure, if you will. And surprisingly, what's surprising to me, it really doesn't. There's not enough water to really firmly lock up the plaster, I suspect. And the tempera paint doesn't add, any drying to the mixture as well. So we're looking for something that is a dark gray and has a relatively thick consistency. The first layer, I think, would be helpful to have it be a little thin so that I can not bulk up areas too thickly. So that is still a little bit too thin because I don't want it to sag. So I'm going to do just a little bit more plaster. And let's do, I don't think I'm going to add more tempera. The bark of trees is really a gray foundation that has browns or maybe greens or tans in it, depending on the tree. And so the foundational color is a charcoal gray. I'm going to add just a touch more plaster. So I wish I could give you this specific recipe, but I think it highlights where some of the creativity comes in, as well as exactly what you're looking to do. If you keep this closed, tight, and I've had it last fine to the next day. Now it pours at this stage, but that's a lot of mass, big glob, if you will. So let's move to the tree. So I'm going back to the same brush that I used before. It's a little more worse for the wear for the glue application. Again, this is a really inexpensive brush, and this also will shrink. So that's something to keep in mind if you feel a little bit concerned about how much you've put on. So you can see those wraps in there, and those are definitely going to stay when it cures and shrinks. So we are going to have to be adding more material to that a little bit later. One thing to keep in mind is the amount of branches that you plan on showing. And why I say that is that as we apply this mixture and 2, or maybe in some areas, I might need 3. We'll see. That's going to thicken the branches, and including the branch tips. So they may not look completely accurate if you're going to have those areas exposed. Say an area or in the fall where leaves are starting to fall off, or perhaps maybe on a branch that recently died, because the very tips of branches are very, very small. And to scale here, they would be, perhaps static grass thickness, something like that. So when you're going to do a tree of that nature, you're going to want to use 28, 30 gauge and have more tips coming off the branches and have them be thinner. Another thing to keep in mind before I leave you so that I can finish applying this is that scale is always something to consider. And typically I work and perhaps many of you work in a 25 to 30 millimeter scale. This is a typical wargaming scale. A lot of miniatures are produced in that scale. 32 millimeter might be on the higher side. I kind of aim my trees at that scale, but you have the luxury of trees pretty much working at any scale. A bigger tree, if this was by, say, a 28 millimeter miniature, it would be a bit of a bigger tree. Say by a 20 millimeter miniature, this would be kind of like a large, maybe old growth tree. However, don't be lax in considering your scale. If your tree is going to be working with larger scale miniatures, say 32 or 54 millimeter, then those extra small details really start to become more and more important. There's a little gap underneath that branch right there. So that's a spot to go in for a little more fill. So I'm going to push in a little bit in there and see how well it fills that on a first pass. Oh, there too. So time to revisit the tree, and it may look a little wackadoodle at the moment. That is an official term, by the way, wackadoodle. But I wanted to start off by saying the way I have constructed this tree is exactly the way you should not build it. So I am not recommending this method. Here are the reasons why. First, as you'll see, in fact, let's do this on the close cam here. Along the trunk here, you'll see all of those ribs coming through of the wrapped wire. Now, despite me doing my best to wrap it as evenly as possible, these ridges are significant, and I'm going to have to thicken this up quite a bit to hide those ridges. So the proportion of the tree is going to change quite a bit. You can see on a branch like this, right, how dominant these ridges are despite my best effort. So what that has caused me to do is to, first and foremost, to begin wrapping wires down the branches to fill some of those gaps. I could fill it with the bark material just as easily, I suppose, but I really wanted to put in some wire, here in particular to fill some of the deepest, gaps in between the ridges. The branch tips are exactly one of my concerns with how the tree's been coming out. So if you can envision for a second me thickening up these branches significantly, I can't thicken up the branch tips, or at least I don't want to, because they should look relatively fine in scale with the tree. So it's going to begin to look very fat-fingered, if you will, and I don't want to do that. We'll have a fairly thick branch with only a couple small, thin branches coming off of it. So not happy with how the tree has progressed to this point at all. Well, there's some parts I like, but in general, you get my idea. One of the things I also noticed is that the proportion of the tree was off and not very realistic. The branches were, in essence, making this kind of a shape where they were getting shorter as we moved to the top. And looking at trees, again, looking at more photos of trees, I realized that most trees are actually a little heavier at the top or form more of a rounded structure. So that meant that I wanted to re-examine how to add more volume to the top of the tree. And so first I did some thickening of the branches here with more wire and added a small branch off to the side, and doing something similar here and extending this branch. I also realized that I'd like to have more significant new branch work coming off of the tree to increase that rounded feel, to give the top of the canopy much more girth and weight. So that meant that I needed to add some branches. So I decided to try something new, and this mess in here, this shows how I've been going about it. So I've twisted up wire that I could cut to size. So I'm making it out of, 2 pieces of my 28 gauge copper. So I decided that I would try just adding a whole bunch of wire to make a new branch. When I twisted this wire, I was able to get a uniform branch that lacks that cabling significantly. I had a little trouble with some twisting here, but it's much more uniform. And then as I worked my way out, I could take off, sections that were being wrapped and twist those up into side branches, that sort of idea. So that is the process I'm at right here, having added a significant number of pieces of wire to twist a new branch that will be coming out this way from the center of the trunk. And I perhaps could have actually scrapped the tree and started over again, but I'm a bit of a terrier trying to dig out a rat from a hole, and I have trouble stopping that. So I decided to keep working on my tree to make improvements to it to get it to the point where I'm satisfied with it. And I think there's the real lesson, is that if it's not looking right, don't accept that unless you want to, but don't feel like it can't be improved. If you're willing to sit down with it and take some more time, everything can be improved. And I've always said that when in the past I was making pieces for clients, my mistakes make it better for the client because I have to fix it. And usually when I fix it, it comes out much better. So I'm going to stop saying that I'm done with it because clearly I'm not. And however long it takes me to get this tree the way I want it is how long it is going to take. And I should mention that if you notice along the backside here, what I've done is I actually took the wires and I made a loop and I pushed them around the back and glued that there to create the branch. That was much easier and relatively fast, actually. sure Mr. Gravett would look at me and go like, why'd you start that way? Did you read my book? And I would say to Mr. Gravett, yes, I did. Yes, I did, sir. And I think your book is excellent. I wished I had followed your instructions a little more closely. So there is that branch at the moment, and I will be coming back to spread it and arrange it once I get another branch or two coming off up here. And that's going to fill out the top of the canopy much better, and I think I'm going to be much more satisfied with how this tree looks. So I hope you enjoyed that look at the first section of my tree barking, and can I verb bark? I am, I guess. Is that a gerund? Doesn't matter. And if you are enjoying these videos, you should consider becoming a patron. You'll be able to see a link to that over here in a minute. And it's a great way to get extra access to things that are Terranscapes related, as well as supporting this channel. And it makes a huge difference. So consider becoming a patron. And I'm going to hold my complete reflections on this process until the end of the third part of this installment, and I will discuss many things at that point. So hopefully you stick around for that. In the meantime, questions and comments are always welcome down below, and hopefully you will be coming back for part 2 of this mini-series, because you know that I will be back soon with another Terranscapes video.